Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. This is my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
So what's
You found a story that I had missed, a medical story. It's in the Times today. What did you find?
yeah, it's a story about brain implants with people who have traumatic brain injuries. Let me start with a kind of a startling statistic. Some 5 million Americans are permanently disabled by traumatic brain injury. 5 million, that's a lot of people. And apparently, there's not a whole lot of treatment, but something that has just recently been done. A very small clinical trial. In fact, they started with just 6 people, but the folks made implants into the brain, and according to the researchers, they're saying this is the very first evidence that you can move the dial on this problem of traumatic brain injury. They talk about a young woman who, when she was 22 years old, had a car crash that left her with fatigue and memory problems and uncontrollable emotions to the degree that she couldn't go to college. She had planned to go to law school. She couldn't go to law school, had to move back home with her parents. Well, some 18 years later, after the crash, in 2018, this young lady received the implant. And she said it changed her life completely. According to her, she can now live a normal life, have normal conversations. And she said it's amazing how she's seen herself improve. Now I'm quoting from Dr. Nicholas Schiff. He's a neurologist at the Weill Cornell Medicine in New York, where the study was conducted. And apparently, they stimulate some region in the brain, um, where a region where signals are connected to each other. Let me see if I can call it. It's a central lateral nucleus is what this particular region is called, deep inside the brain. It's a crucial hub in the network of neurons inside the brain, very small, the size and shape of an almond shell. Uh, Apparently, reading the story, David, it seems like there's a lot of trial and error. Although they've done a lot of mapping of the brain, there's a lot of stuff that's unknown about how it really works. Apparently, they have been able to put electrodes in the brain to treat Parkinson's disease, restoring some function of the brain. But this is a new procedure and a new area of the brain. And they did some testing of the volunteers before the implants were made. And after the implants, their scores on some of these exams increased 15 to 50%. So they're starting to get a better understanding, though they don't really know how it works or why it works. Uh, but it works, and they tried it in 6 patients. One patient dropped out. 5 of the patients improved significantly. So again, they don't really know why. They don't really know what's happening, but the evidence appears to be that it's working. So they're going to expand the trial and see if they can't replicate the results. But so far, this is apparently one of the first breakthroughs in treating traumatic brain injury. And the researchers here at Cornell Medicine in New York seem to be pretty optimistic that they may have found something here.
Let me give you some perspective on this because I
Mm-hmm.
know a little bit about brain injuries and have been dealing with them for a few years. I'm getting around fine, although I've had a serious problem with falls. So I've had 2 MRIs. I have my own neurologist and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned there was a worry at a time that I had Parkinson's. So it turns out I don't. It was my neurologist, the surgeon, I don't. Even though I have a tremor, it's not like Parkinson's, he says.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been watching a lot of this stuff. What I can tell you first, brain implants are now standard medical practice for many people with Parkinson's and with epilepsy. There's certainly tens of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of people in the States who have had brain implants.
Mm-hmm.
Generally works well. They have the implants incredibly thin so that it causes few problems and fairly little trauma.
Let me ask you this: then, when they make the implants, is it an implant and they hit you with a signal, or is it a permanent implant that's something that
Now,
sits there?
what they're talking about here, there's lots of ways they hit you with a signal, which is called transcranial, i.e., the bones around your skull, magnetic something or other,
Mm-hmm.
which is common in Parkinson's. They now have very, very thin implants that let them to deliver a measured amount of electricity to a particular region in the brain. It has to be totally guided by the radiologist to find the right part. Our brains are enormously complicated.
Yeah.
Literally a trillion neurons, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And about 120 different areas in the brain have been identified. And what does what? They're starting to understand general principles. They know where speech is coming from. They know what part of the brain recognizes faces, things like that. There have been enormous advances, even though anybody in the field will tell you there's a heck of a lot they don't know. So, this is something to consider. It's good medical news that there results in 5 patients, which is definitely not something to go to. But let me take that to something that I've learned. It really does help to have a good doctor who's aware of what's going on and what's there. We had the story last week about cures for sickle cell.
Mm-hmm.
That's happening, and we may come back to that. There's so much happening in medicine the last 10 years that I've gone back to reading the medical journals, or at least the summaries on the web of the New England Journal and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We've talked that, and I know you've emphasized, Dave, and largely, or not largely, but in part based on your own personal experience with the medical profession, that really we encourage folks to seek practitioners who are associated with colleges and universities where these studies are going on, because there's so many advances and so much going on in the field in terms of improvement in the science of medicine, that you really want to be on top of the latest stuff. So the university hospitals that are associated with large universities tend to be those that are on top of some of the latest research going on. Not always effective, but at least cutting edge research looking at potential cures and solutions.
I put it a little bit differently. I say find a good doctor who makes a point of keeping up. And I'm sure there's some who don't happen to be associated with universities, partly because you can make more money practicing as a physician independently.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but get a good doctor who knows what's going on and get you pointed in the right direction. Let me also say something I've learned from what some very good doctors have taught me. This article is misleading.
Really?
It's saying there's nothing you can do about certain kinds of brain injuries. Every doctor that I know, and I've talked to a half dozen good ones over the last few years, I've had a major operation and then some, uh, tells me that it's really important to keep your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and your blood sugar down.
Mm-hmm.
That when you're looking at how you help a patient who's had a stroke, physical therapy, again, I can talk from experience, really can help. But the most important thing is stay on top of blood pressure, sugar, and cholesterol. Those aren't cures. but they can make a significant difference. And that belonged in this Times article, frankly.
Mm-hmm. So
It was not just
you're saying you think that basic stuff could help with traumatic brain injury.
It certainly dramatically can affect what happens to somebody who's had traumatic brain injury, such as a stroke, over the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, no evidence that it tends to reverse it, but it prevents people who've had traumatic brain injuries, particularly strokes, which are not usually from trauma, but could be, uh, are in much higher risk of having another one. So that key part of the treatment is cutting down on the chances of you having another one.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, I don't know whether we'll get to it in this show, is who should take aspirin, small dose, and who shouldn't. I've got some stuff from Mount Sinai Hospital that seemed right to the point if we get to that.
Okay. Well, before we get to that, I just while we're talking about the brain and the head, I wanted just to mention a story before the show. You mentioned that this is something that's been talked about historically for some time. I was not aware of it. The story that just came out just today about the use of hair straightening creams and their correlation with cancer.
There's some really dramatic numbers in that story.
Blew me away, Dave. I mean, they don't know what chemicals in the hair straightening products are causing this. Some say it's formaldehyde, but there are a lot of products that do not contain formaldehyde. But apparently, this studies the researchers found out that the women who use the hair straightening products were four or more times likely to develop uterine cancer compared with those who didn't. This is in a 2022 study in the Journal of National Cancer Institute. I mean, that's an astounding number, Dave. I mean, and uterine cancer at that from use of a hair straightener. And as I know most of
it gets into the bloodstream.
okay.
What they put on your head can get into your bloodstream.
Yeah, get through the scalp, right? Okay.
So much, which is why, for example, minoxidil, which I've been known to use to not lose all my hair, you don't worry too much about putting it on the surface, but some of it can. So that would explain. The correlation here has been known for a while, but why it happens and just which chemicals cause it and whether it really is a cause, the correlation is so strong there probably is some causal effect.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I don't have to tell most of our listeners and viewers, they know that probably the largest populations that uses these products are Black women that have historically used hair straightening products. I don't want to go into all the whys and wherefores. A lot of it has to do with the perpetuation of the European white centric look of long straight hair, which most Black folks don't have, and their attempts to mimic that hair. That's what these products do. And
let me come in here.
What a horrible side effect.
More pervasive than what we're saying. I'm a guy. I like women. I like looking at women, and I really like looking at women whose hair is natural.
Mm-hmm.
It's always felt that the ones who have so much hair straightening and so on, it just feels artificial and it doesn't feel attractive. As a guy, I say, keep the natural hair. And now, as you understand, there may be a health consequence, yet one more reason.
Yeah, well, Dave, you and I are old enough. We matured and became adults in the '60s, and I certainly remember. The Black is beautiful, the natural, and the whole emphasis on wearing your hair natural. But here we are, some 50, 60 years later, and these products are still, pervasive. I mean, it's it's a cultural battle as well as a medical battle.
Now, who determines what beauty is It's terribly subjective. At my grandmother's age in Russia, where she grew up, you wanted somebody who had some meat on their bones.
Mm-hmm.
They would be better and leaner. And in most of Africa, big women have been very much appreciated
Yeah.
until recently. But I've spoken to a few African women lately who say that's not true anymore. Everybody in West Africa wants to be skinny like the Europeans.
Yeah, that's Western media, Dave. And when you say who determines, well, I think it's, pardon me, it's the programming. It's the media programming, it's the images and in the movies, on television, and other related media, print and electronic media, that perpetuate these images of beauty, where it's slim, it's thin, it's not dark skin. It's if it's African American or non-white, it's fair skin, and straight hair is certainly something that seems to be favored. So, I think who determines it is I think it's perpetuated by the media. Just to answer your unspoken
And I
question
give
there.
you the bad joke here.
Hmm.
Most of fashion is ruled by men who are not that interested in women.
That's another
And I will
interesting
tell you, as a
perspective.
man who likes women, I think natural hair is great. The more the
Hmm.
better.
Hmm.
Okay, we've got a lot more to cover. What
Okay,
next?
so did you want to talk a little bit about the aspirin story now, David? We're
Okay,
talking
let me
about
go with that.
healthcare.
It's pretty simple. I just got a mailing from Mount Sinai Hospital, where I go, and it said things that I've known for a few years and got heard from. If you have a cause, if you've had a heart operation, a heart attack, possibly a stroke, strongly recommended you take a small quarter-sized baby aspirin every day. That's from my neurologist and my cardiologist, and it's the standard medical advice.
Hmm.
But what if you're 50, 60, 70 years old, don't have a heart history? Should you take that aspirin? Well, there's a good story here. The way they figured it out, as I'm remembering the story, is that in the big Framingham study, they had a very surprising finding. People who had arthritis had fewer heart attacks.
Hmm.
What? Why? And eventually they realized that many people with arthritis took aspirin, and they
Hmm.
looked, and aspirin does prevent drug clotting and does reduce your chances of heart attacks. At the time, I asked my brother, who was a doctor at a fancy institution in Massachusetts, should I do it? And he said, well, he doesn't really know, but all the cardiologists he knows are taking aspirin.
Hmm.
This was 30 or 40 years ago. Since then, the advice has totally changed for people who don't have cardiac problem or known cardiac problem, that you probably shouldn't take aspirin because the risk of bleeding, stomach bleeding, gastrointestinal bleeding, because of the aspirin outweighs the benefit in reduced risk to your heart.
Okay, well, there you go.
The data
Hmm.
is really clear. It really hit home because my stepmother one day, who had arthritis, took a lot of aspirin, almost died one night. In fact, if she hadn't been able to get my brother on the phone, who arranged for an ambulance to pick her up, she probably would not have woken up the next morning.
Hmm.
She had a
Aspirin
stroke,
overdose day.
not an overdose. Aspirin increases your risk of stomach bleeding.
Okay.
Her stomach started bleeding. It left her feeling very faint, so she called my brother. My brother happens to be a paramedic, so immediately he said, we're getting you to the hospital in an ambulance.
Hmm.
And when they got there, they found, yes, she had bleeding, gave her a transfusion, and she had another 10 years of life after that.
Hmm.
But that's why they're not usually recommending aspirin unless you have a particularly high risk,
Hmm.
such as having had a heart operation.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, but
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, what's the
No, I was just
question?
going to ask, do we have any other medical stories before we go to break. Have a couple minutes before our break. I know we talked the last couple of weeks about breakthroughs in sickle cell anemia treatment
Oh, yeah.
and
I
the
wanted to come
gene
to that.
editing techniques. Is there an update on that, Dave?
Yeah, I wanted to come to that. Uh, in a previous show, we were, and I think everybody should be enthusiastic that they apparently have a cure for most sickle cell. Sickle cell can be a horrible, debilitating disease, leaving people in such agony they become dependent on narcotics, and sometimes that's not enough to help. There are some medicines that can help some now, but the most dramatic thing is they are able to cure sickle cell with gene editing, CRISPR. Okay, so that hit the press when the studies came through not long ago, and we brought it to the radio. But from Nature this week, an editorial asking, who will get this CRISPR drug? Only a very small number of people are likely to benefit from the first improved treatment.
Yeah, it's crazy expensive, isn't that right, Dave? What, a couple $1 million or something per treatment?
They're talking about $2 million.
Huh.
You spend 2 months in the hospital because in order to do this, they have to totally knock out your immune system, which
Mm-hmm.
is very dangerous. The only other case I know where that's routinely done is leukemia patients who are going to die otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I have a friend who had that treatment and is with us 8 years later.
Mm. Nice.
But he knew when he would get into the hospital, and it is dangerous as heck to wipe out the immune system. My
Mm.
friend who went into the hospital was very aware he might not come out.
So this sickle cell treatment, is it likely to get cheaper? Is there any kind of prognosis as to where it's going
There's
to go?
lots of people working on ways to improve it.
Mm.
There are lots of improvements. I think we brought to this show that they have now, using artificial intelligence, identified 180 other paths in different organisms that can affect gene editing. Where gene editing comes from is your body is constantly being attacked by bacteria and viruses that it has to fight against. And one of the ways it does it is it hits something that cuts the virus that's in your system. And there are other ways the body, when your DNA is cut accidentally, can repair the DNA and put it back together.
Mm-hmm.
The Nobel Prize not long ago was for a system that could let you fairly reliably cut somebody's DNA, cut out the genes that were dangerous, or insert a gene that helps. And that absolutely is curative for many people, many things. It was 15 years between the time they first started doing it and the time it became reliable, which is only the last 2 or 3 years. But that's one of the great advances of medicine. So, yes, I am sure there's not a doctor in a Black neighborhood in the United States who is not very aware of how to treat sickle cell and probably can do it fine. But you really want to be at a doctor who not merely knows the basics of treatment, but knows all the advances and all the latest research. And that's, again, my advice to anybody. Get yourself to a doctor you have a reason to trust. May or may not be at a university if you don't, but if you don't know somebody who you have reason to trust, go to a big university near you. They're
Mm-hmm.
likely to be on top of things.
Okay, we're going to take a brief break. I know among some of the other things I want to talk about when we come back, Dave, is uh, censorship of the internet in school systems that's happening across the country to the detriment of the young people, blocking out all kinds of vital information that they need, as well as
I remember when I was graduating,
you
and
what?
they refused to when I was graduating high school, that's a
Mm-hmm.
long time ago, they refused to let me speak at graduation, although I had earned that place, because I refused to let them censor my speech in advance.
Oh wow, okay.
They just cut me off the program. So this isn't
Yeah,
new.
censorship is not new, that's for sure. What's happening now is the algorithms that they're using looks like they're really not very effective. They're kind of like very broad based, very hatchet type of approach. But we'll talk about that when we come back. This is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3, the voice of Harlem, with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a brief musical break.
I'll keep you warm in December, warm when the cold breezes blow. My arms so loving, a kind of oven to melt the sleet and snow. This heart that glows like an ember, it longs to be loved just by you. If it could be so, then you keep me so warm in December too. An ember longs to be loved just by you. If it could be so, then you'd keep me so warm in December, warm in December, warm in December too.
Okay, we're back. Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid. Dave, wanted to talk a little bit about a story I came across that I found very interesting, and that had to do with censorship in the American school system. Apparently, back in the year 2000, something called the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA, was passed by Congress, requiring schools to block, quote, unquote, child pornography and other content deemed, quote, obscene or, quote, harmful to minors in order to be eligible for federal technology aid known as E-rate funding. And that's funny that almost all schools in the country get. So that's something that school systems across the country have had to adhere to, but it's had some fairly, I will say, unintended consequences. Maybe not unintended, but some unforeseen consequences. Recent study of Albuquerque Public School District, where students are having a hard time. They can't access a lot of information. In particular, students were trying to access a suicide hotline and a suicide hotline number, and they were blocked. Apparently, keyword suicide popped up and they couldn't get it. Other kids were trying to access information around Black history and slavery. And the slavery word apparently is something that got blocked. And LGBTQ information and access to Latino websites are blocked. Again, keywords that apparently are in the algorithm for some of these filters, and ended up blocking out a lot of critical information. A couple filter companies, one called Go Guardian, another called Bloxy, that were used in Albuquerque, where this particular study was done, and just widespread censorship. This particular study studied 117 million censorship records that confirmed that students and civil rights advocates what they had long warned, that web filters are preventing kids from finding critical information about their health, identity, and subjects they're studying in class. In the Albuquerque district, following a lot of criticism, some of it as a result of this study, the school system changed from one system to a different system, that they're now using the Biloxi system as opposed to the Go Guardian system. But a lot of folks don't believe that there's going to be any significant kind of opening up the web to the young people.
You mean you don't think that it's important for 14 and 16-year-olds to be able to get birth control information?
Oh, I mean, it's so basic, and one of the things that hit me as an African American, David, there's so much going on now across the country, trying to erase Black history, trying to kind of really just kind of sanitize the history of Black Americans, particularly during the slavery period and Jim Crow era, to whitewash it. And these algorithms are aiding and abetting that. Folks tried to access information around the 1619 project, and the Bloxy filter blocked that. They couldn't get access to that information. So I mean, what I'm saying is that I'm not going to be totally paranoid and say that these blocks are intended, but look at the way that they are affecting kids' access to information, both healthcare as well as mental health. And the example I just raised, the history of African Americans here in the U.S., how it is filtering and blocking out because of these key words that triggers the algorithm. And of course, key words like hate and slavery and torture and so much that happened to Black Americans throughout slavery and the Jim Crow era that is being filtered out by these filters that are being used across the United States because of that 2000 law that I just mentioned, the SIPA law. So I'm wondering what your take is on that, David. To me, it looks like really broad scale censorship.
Were killed by the expansion of the British colonies to the West and California.
You say how many Native Americans
were killed?
I don't have a number, but I know most of them. How about that? I don't know the number.
And that's not right, because the number was so large. It is one of the most important things to know about American history.
Yes, that's the Holocaust.
And that's the kind of thing that a lot of people don't want people to know.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good chance that the Oscar is going to go next year. They just won the Film Critics Award to what is it? Something Moon, the Scorsese's film about how the Indian tribe was almost wiped out by whites killing them because they wanted access to the oil.
Okay, that's a familiar story.
That's a familiar story, but the details is I didn't know either, and I've read a lot of history, and I think I don't know whether you knew what happened to the Osage Indians, but most people haven't, and that's a kind of censorship. The victors write the history books, There's a whole lot of people who don't realize how many war crimes, for example, were committed by the Allies in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Not 6 million in one group, but right and left. The firebombing of Dresden, the
Yeah.
firebombing of Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that should be part of our history to
Yeah.
know. We
Yeah.
don't want it to happen
Yeah.
again, as it is happening again today in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
So
So
let's
I mean
stick to the
it's a two-prong approach. There's been a lot of attention lately about the legislation of on state and local levels to eliminate books, to eliminate curriculum that teaches this stuff. But this is a whole nother level of internet access filtering that school systems are doing in order to maintain their federal funding under the E-rate program, and it's having a very negative effect in much the same way, filtering out access to a lot of that historical information, as well as healthcare and mental health access and resources that young people need.
In 1968, when I graduated high school, there was profound issues in the streets of New York, among others, and that was the year Martin Luther King was killed, and many other things. And that was the year of the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some very strong positions on some of those things. So I was supposed to speak at my high school graduation. They wanted to review my speech before I gave it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said no, and hence I was not allowed to give the speech.
Mm-hmm.
This happens in a whole lot of places, a whole lot of times. But let's talk about something that's, well, probably it's definitely more interesting, and it's more original because this is something that couldn't have happened 3 years ago. 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, who were the Bantu people? Where did they live? And how did they wind up when in South Africa? Do you have answers on that?
No, I don't have answers, but I understand there's some genetic research that I've been able to fill in some of the blanks on that.
It just came out in Nature. It's called The Genetic Legacy of the Expansion of Bantu-Speaking Peoples in Africa. They have taken 1,300 genomes of people in Africa today, and a handful, 12, from people 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. With that, they can give a pretty good estimate of where the people we now know as Bantu speaking came from, or where the language originated. And it was in West Africa. Today, many of the Bantu speakers are, of course, living in what were called Bantustans, when a part in the apartheid area of South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get there when? Well, partly because they can get the traces from 4,000 years ago and the skeletons that were accidentally preserved. And they've done this all over Europe. They can tell you how many Vikings made it to the Shetland Islands north of Scotland, for example, with pretty good accuracy. And that and how many of the men in the Shetland Islands probably died because their genes died out, but the women's genes did not for some reason. You can guess how that happened historically. But the other thing is that you can do a genomic clock. It's pretty well established that on average, mutations happen at a standard rate. Of your 30,000 genes, or 3 billion base pairs, they're going to be 100 to 200 mutations in your parents, in the cell that winds up growing into you. Most of them harmless. Some of them turn out to be very significant, like sickle cell and other genetic diseases, although sickle cell may be an advantage in malaria areas because it happens to protect against malaria somewhat. So since you know how many mutations have happened, you can look at where the mutations are. If there are a lot of mutations, it means these people have lived there a long time. If there are, yes, if there are fewer mutations, you can say, well, the fewer mutations among the Bantu-speaking people in South Africa, they haven't been there as long as the people in West Africa, so that the Bantu-speaking people started in West Africa. This is brand new research. I knew it all in Europe, but they didn't have enough samples in Africa to give you the information. They now have had an international effort. There was like 60 authors on the paper because every university.
Now, Dave, I'm not an expert, but now is this something that historians have not known?
Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
How the heck, when there are almost no artifacts around and no written records until 500 years ago, do you figure out what tribes lived in what part of Africa 4,000 and 6,000 years ago? You couldn't. It turns out that you can. They've done a lot of research over the last 50 or 75 years, taking the oral histories that did survive and using those to pick up a lot of history going back 500 and 1,000 years before anybody in Africa was writing. But there are very few artifacts that have survived. There's very little for the archaeologists. It's very hard. But we know this approach works quite well because in Europe and the Middle East, where you have 3,000 years of written records and lots of, for example, Iron Age and Bronze Age tools surviving 3,000 and 4,000 years that you can study. When they got the genetic analysis, starting about 20 years ago, and really in volume about 5 or 10, and there are a couple of really good books on it, it turned out that most of what they had figured out by looking at the archaeology, looking at the pottery, looking at the language patterns, and so on, was confirmed by the genetics. So it's highly likely that the same genetic techniques now used on Africans probably give very reliable information about where the Bantu-speaking people came from.
Okay, I just wanted to point out, Dave, that the Egyptian civilization had written records that go back 4,000 or 5,000 years, and some of the other.
I've seen them.
Yes,
there's a plaque in the Egyptian Museum in
Cairo.
Cairo.
As it's kept, Egypt is an African nation. So it's not that there were no written records 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in Africa.
There were more precise and said sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
Egypt and North Africa have much better, both because of the written records and because the drier climate makes it easier to preserve things. But I did say Middle East had it, and Egypt is also in the Middle East.
No, Egypt is in Africa. Egypt is not in the Middle East. Egypt is on the African continent.
It's absolutely on the African continent. It is an African country. Yes. And what is the most popular language spoken in Africa? French, English?
Swahili.
Arabic.
Okay.
Because there's both north of the Sahara and in the whole, what used to be called the Sudan, which went all the way into West Africa, that has been Arabic for 1,000 years. Countries like Mali which is, of course, south of the Sahara. And in Nigeria, a huge part of the population, maybe a quarter, is Arabic speaking. And Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. I didn't know that till I was talking to some Africans about 10 years ago. And they were Francophone. They had trouble in English. So we talked a little bit about the different language things. And they asked me, what's the biggest language in Africa? And I didn't know. But they told me it was Arabic. And it is.
And they have been keeping written records for a few thousand years as well.
not much south of that Sahara, though, which is what
Mhm.
we're talking about here. I mean, Carthage in Rome has loads of records going back 2,500 years. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage,
Mhm.
Hannibal crossing the Alps with the
Mhm.
elephants.
Mhm.
Although apparently most of the elephants didn't make it. He only had a few when still living
Mhm.
when he made it to Italy.
And of course, so much of the records was destroyed, and when Alexandria was destroyed. So I mean, there were records, but they're not available to us. No, or no longer exist.
Yeah, and I've been really disappointed. I've been expecting since I was a kid that there would be more Greek plays coming out and more Aristotle and more Plato and so on, of which we have a lot, but far from all. And because until then, there were discoveries after discoveries, up to, in fact, right after World War II, the Cairo Geniza gave us the Gnostic Gospels.
Mhm.
The first 300 years of Christianity had some very different things that made it into the New Testament.
Right. Mhm.
So I thought we'd keep discovering, but there's been very few. Actually, the people, the archaeologists, and before that, the scholars who went to all the monasteries from Sinai to Switzerland and found almost all of that which was to be found. There is some interesting stuff that is starting to happen with new technology, but hasn't been dramatic enough to get us new plays. You can, with the right uh, X-rays and similar, find out what's underneath the writing of palimpsest. And it used to be that many books were taken, paper was so expensive, and a lot of it was actually parchment, vellum, which was animal skins. It was so expensive that if you wanted to do something, you got some of the old stuff, wiped away the ink that was on it, and put the new stuff. And they're now able to read some of the things that are underneath it, which has been uh, some use to scholarship. But one of the ones that just came out in the last month is the Babylonian cuneiform. This is an AI thing. I just saw the article. It's only a week or two old. You There are thousands and thousands of clay tablets that were in temples that burned to the ground and hence were preserved.
Mhm.
Many of which have never been translated, and some of which couldn't be translated. They threw artificial intelligence at it, machine learning, and they are getting usable translations of a lot of the tablets that scholars didn't or couldn't read. AI does really work
Okay.
for us.
That's going to be interesting. That's going to be
Well,
interesting.
it's not going to be interesting mostly because it's mostly going to say farmer's zone has 63 cattle, so his taxes should be 2 cattle a year. That's most of what you
You
find
think it's mostly just government and industry records.
at county records, but
Hmm.
you also have the Great Flood and some of the great stories that come out of Babylonia, which were preserved that way.
Hmm.
And there's some where we don't have it all because it's on multiple tablets, many of which have been half destroyed. So if you go through the classic stories from Babylonia, there's often things where they're just put in brackets saying untranslatable
Hmm.
or not
Hmm.
available.
Hmm.
And a little of that's going to be improved.
Hmm. Okay, what else we got, Dave? We got about 5 minutes before we got to close up here. What else do we want to hit before we finish up?
Well, something that we talked about before is that life expectancy in the United States went down the last few years.
Hmm.
I don't think that has happened anywhere except Russia that wasn't a time of war in the last 50 years. Russia, when the Soviets were knocked out, it really got bad there.
Hmm.
Life expectancy went down 3 or 4 years.
Hmm.
That's
Now,
just stuff.
did COVID play a role in that, Dave?
That's what I'm telling you here. The U.S. life expectancy went down mostly because of COVID, and it's come back up, and about half of what it had gone down from 1919 to 1922 has been recovered because COVID and 80% of the recovery was fewer people dying of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, half the people who would have died of COVID in the early days can now be saved
Mm-hmm.
and all saved. And we have vaccines. So the COVID death rate is down, but we are still looking at life expectancy. It went up from 76.4 years in 2021 to 77.5.
Okay, that's
But
significant.
before the pandemic, it was 78.8. Also, a lot more people dying of overdoses
Mm-hmm.
and of suicides.
Mm.
Homicides are actually down,
Mm-hmm.
even though there's all this noise about these crime waves and so on. The actual number of homicides is down.
That's good.
That's a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
except in Chicago, but it's still absurd. Chirac, did you see that?
No, I did not.
That was a Spike Lee movie.
Yeah, I know of it. I haven't seen it. Mm-hmm.
I've seen it. Most people didn't like it so much. It was a comedy based on a Greek comedy of the women who withdraw their favors from the men if they didn't end the war.
Oh, Lysistrata.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought that to Chicago now, where the death rate and the killing and the murders between the gangs has been unbelievably high. 4 or 5 times the murder rate in New York, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Spike Lee made the movie about it, which I thought was great. But I guess if you weren't into Greek comedies, maybe it wasn't for you. Jenny didn't like it so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, Dave. Well, we're about out of time. Interesting show today where we kind of went around the horn from brain implants to hair straightening to Bantu and African history to censorship in schools. A lot of stuff going on.
Well,
Any final thoughts or comments?
I'm in the middle of the AI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thankful I didn't bore you with a lot of the nonsense that's going
Yeah, there's so much going on. We gave it a break today.
Who gave a $15 million contract to a company he was invested in, Sam Altman. That just came out 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. But we had more interesting stories this week.
Okay. So thanks all for listening. This has been Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Tune in. Just might learn something. Thanks. See you next week.